My daughter-in-law turned my son against me, cut me out of my granddaughter's life for 12 years, and called me dangerous to the whole family. But the morning she showed up at my luxury penthouse with suitcases and said, "We're moving in," she forgot I wasn't the broken woman. She left behind the morning Jessica showed up at my door with 4 suitcases, a car seat, and the audacity of a woman who had never once faced consequences. I was standing in my kitchen in a silk robe, drinking a cortado, watching the sun come up over the city. She rang the bell 3 times, then knocked, then rang again. I set my cup down slowly, walked to the intercom, pressed the button. "Yes? Mom, it's Jessica. Buzz us up. 12 years. That was how long it had been since she'd called me anything at all. I looked at my reflection in the dark window glass. 61 years old, 12 floors up, a penthouse I'd bought with my own money, in my own name, in a city she didn't even know I lived in until 2 weeks ago. I pressed the intercom again. "I know who you are," I said. Then I walked back to my cortado and let her ring. "My name is Margaret Claire Okafor. Before I was Okafor, I was Margaret Claire Bellamy, which tells you I was born in the South, raised with manners, and taught to hold my tongue in ways that quietly destroyed me for 40 years. I'm a retired pediatric occupational therapist. I spent 31 years helping children with motor delays, sensory disorders, and neurological differences learn to navigate a world that wasn't built for them. I was good at it, patient, precise. I understood that behavior is communication, and that when someone is hurting you, the first question to ask is always, what are they actually trying to say? I applied that framework to Jessica for over a decade. I kept giving her the benefit of the doubt, right up until the morning I finally understood that some people aren't communicating. Some people are simply extracting. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without Michael. My son Michael was born in 1985. The kind of child who made strangers stop in grocery store aisles just to comment on his eyes. He was golden from the beginning, thoughtful, sensitive, funny in a quiet way that took you by surprise. His father, Leonard, left when Michael was 11, and I won't pretend that didn't leave a mark. Leonard was a charming man with expensive taste and a talent for making you feel like the problem. When he walked out, he took our savings account and left Michael a note that said, "You'll understand when you're older." Michael never really did. He was 26 when he met Jessica at a work conference in Charlotte. She was 23, sharp-looking, well-dressed, the kind of woman who commands a room by making every man in it feel like he's been singled out. She had this way of tilting her head when she listened to you, like you were the most important person in any room. I noticed, the first night I met her, that she turned that tilt on and off like a faucet. I didn't say anything. I should have. They dated for 8 months and got engaged on New Year's Eve 2012. I was happy for Michael. Cautious, but happy. My daughter-in-law was smart, ambitious, and clearly loved my son in her way. I told myself the caution I felt was just the ordinary fear of any mother watching her child commit to someone new. It wasn't. The first real sign came 3 months before the wedding. I had planned a bridal shower for Jessica. Not elaborate, just a luncheon at my house, 12 women, good food, her favorite flowers. I'd spent the better part of 2 Saturdays getting things ready. The morning of the shower, she called and told me she'd decided to have it at her college roommate Bree's house instead. Different vibe, she said, more her style. I said, of course. I understood. What I didn't understand until later, when Jessica's aunt pulled me aside at the reception to ask how I'd felt about all that drama, was that Jessica had told people I'd planned the shower without consulting her, imposed my taste, and refused to change it when she asked. Her aunt had heard I'd thrown a fit, had to be talked down. None of that happened. Not one word of it. That was the first document I should have kept. I didn't. I was still operating on the assumption that misunderstandings were innocent. The second sign came at Thanksgiving 2012. We ate at Jessica's parents' house, a large, loud, warm family who I liked immediately, which in retrospect explains some of what came later. You don't need to manage a relationship you're confident in. Jessica's mother, Linda, had seated me next to her own mother, and we talked for an hour about occupational therapy and child development, and I'd felt, for the first time, genuinely welcomed. At the end of the night, Linda had touched my arm and said, "I'm so glad Michael has you." 2 weeks later, Michael called me to say that Jessica felt the Thanksgiving seating had been uncomfortable for her, that I'd monopolized her grandmother, hadn't made enough effort to connect with Jessica's siblings, and that she was feeling some anxiety about the family dynamics going into the wedding. I reviewed the evening in my memory like a detective going back over footage. I could find nothing. I apologized anyway. I was 61 years younger in my emotional intelligence than I am now, which is to say I still believed that when someone tells you you've caused harm, the gracious response is to assume they're right. Michael seemed relieved by my apology. Jessica sent me a text that said, "Thank you for hearing me." I felt briefly like we'd turned a corner. We had not turned a corner. We had entered a longer corridor. They married in September 2013. The wedding was beautiful. I wore a dusty rose dress that Jessica had pre-approved, sat where I was told, made no speeches that weren't pre-scripted, and told myself that navigating a new daughter-in-law's expectations was simply the cost of watching my son be happy. For the first 2 years, things were tense but manageable. Jessica controlled the holiday schedule, the communication, the narrative, but I told myself this was normal young couple territory. I called Michael on his cell, sent birthday cards, attended the events I was invited to. Then, in February 2015, my granddaughter was born, Sophia. I was in the waiting room for 6 hours. Michael came out with his face wide open with joy and grabbed both my hands and said, "Mom, She's perfect. I cried. I'm not ashamed of that. I held Sophia for 11 minutes. I counted. I still count. Because that was the last time I held her for 12 years. It started with logistics. I lived 40 minutes away, and Jessica found the drive inconvenient. So visits got scheduled, officially scheduled, with a calendar request and a confirmation window. 2 weeks notice minimum, no drop-bys. I agreed to all of it. Then the visits started getting canceled. Not in advance. The morning of sometimes. Sophia was fussy. Sophia had a cold. They had other plans that came up. I would drive to their neighborhood sometimes and just sit in my car outside a coffee shop because being close felt like something. I stopped doing that when I realized it was making me pathetic in a way I couldn't afford. In late 2015, something shifted. I could feel it in Michael's voice. A new carefulness, like he was choosing each word before he said it. Our calls got shorter. He stopped bringing up Sophia unprompted. When I asked questions, he answered them, but the answers felt rehearsed. In November 2015, I sent Sophia a birthday card. She'd turned 8 months old. The card came back to my address, unopened, 4 days later. There was no note, just my own handwriting looking back at me. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with that envelope in my hands. I told myself it was a postal error, because you do that. You find the version of events that lets you stay in relationship with your own child, even when the evidence says the relationship has already been changed without your consent. In January 2016, I got a call from my sister-in-law, Helen. Her daughter had run into Jessica at a birthday party, and the conversation had turned to family. Jessica had told her, in the gentle but concerned tone she was very good at deploying, that she was worried about Margaret, that I had some unresolved mental health struggles, some issues with emotional regulation, and that they were trying to be careful about how much exposure Sophia had until things stabilized. I had never in my life been diagnosed with anything. I'd spent 31 years in clinical settings. I did talk therapy in my 30s because I valued self-awareness, and I mentioned that to Jessica once at a dinner where we were having an honest conversation about emotional resilience. She had filed it away like a weapon. I called Michael. He told me that Jessica was just protective, that I had, in his words, sometimes had a hard time with change. He said they weren't cutting me out, they were just pausing to get their footing as new parents. I asked him when the footing would be found. He said he didn't know. That was February 2016. Sophia was 11 months old. I didn't see her again until she was 13. What happens to a person when they are quietly, systematically excluded from the life of someone they love? I know the clinical answer. I spent 30 years watching it happen to children in reverse. Children left out, talked over, managed away from full participation in their own lives. What happens is, you accommodate, then you grieve, then you get very, very quiet. And then, if you're lucky, if you have the right combination of stubbornness and professional clarity, you get organized. I started keeping records in 2017, not obsessively. I wasn't in a revenge spiral. I was a woman who understood documentation because I'd worked in a field where it protected vulnerable people. I kept a simple log, dates of canceled visits, texts I sent that went unanswered, holiday cards returned unopened, a voicemail Michael left in March 2017 that said, in a tight voice, that Jessica had concerns about certain patterns and they needed more space. I did not know what patterns he meant. When I asked, he said he couldn't go into detail right now. I wrote it all down. I also started writing letters, not to Michael, not to Jessica, to Sophia. I wrote them on good stationery, dated them, put them in sealed envelopes, and kept them in a box on my closet shelf. I wrote about what she'd been like as a newborn, how she'd smelled like something ancient and new at the same time, how Michael had counted her fingers 3 times because he couldn't believe they were real. I wrote about what I'd wanted to teach her, how to make my grandmother's biscuits, how to identify bird calls, how to tell when a person means what they say and when they're performing. I wrote about who I was, so that someday, if she wanted to know, she'd have a record that wasn't filtered through someone else's agenda. By 2020, I had 43 letters in that box. In 2018, I began to hear things through the broader family network, cousins, Michael's Aunt Patricia, old mutual friends who'd known us both since Michael was small. The story had evolved. Now I was, depending on who was telling it, either mentally unstable, controlling and manipulative, or simply a difficult woman who couldn't accept that her son had a family of his own. The phrase, "she was toxic for Michael," made its first appearance in 2018. Patricia heard it from Jessica's mother at a 4th of July cookout. I was not at the cookout. I was not invited to cookouts anymore. What disturbed me most wasn't the words themselves. It was the consistency. Across different conversations, in different social circles, with different family members, the story was always the same talking points, the same framing, the same specific phrases, emotional problems, difficult, not safe. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident. That's a managed narrative. I knew what managed narratives looked like because I'd watched pharmaceutical companies use them in pediatric contexts, and I'd watched hospital administrators use them to protect themselves from liability. Someone had thought this through. Someone had decided what the story would be and had worked deliberately to make sure everyone heard the same version. That was when I stopped giving Jessica the benefit of the doubt, not out of anger, out of professional clarity. What was being done to me was strategic, and it deserved a strategic response. That year, I hired an attorney, not to sue anyone, not yet, but because I'd spent 2 years watching a narrative build around me that bore no relationship to reality, and I understood, professionally, clinically, personally, that when a false story has momentum, you need a foundation to stand on when it arrives at your door. I contacted Sandra Elaine Marsh, a family law attorney in Charlotte with 22 years of experience, specializing in grandparent rights and custodial disputes. She reviewed my documentation. She told me that North Carolina recognized limited grandparent visitation rights under specific circumstances, but that without a significant change in family structure, separation, divorce, documented neglect, my options were narrow. Keep documenting, she said. Keep yourself stable and above reproach. These situations often shift. I asked her what she meant by shift. Marriages end, she said simply. And when they do, people remember who was actually there. I went home and updated my folder. Sandra also connected me with Dr. Priya Nair, a licensed clinical psychologist with a specialization in family systems and estrangement, who had been an expert witness in grandparent alienation cases in 3 states. I wasn't in crisis. I want to be clear about that. I went to her because I wanted to understand what was being done clinically, so that I wasn't just absorbing it without a framework. Dr. Nair had a phrase she used in our 4th session that I have not forgotten. You can't unhear a story that was planted in childhood. She was talking about Sophia, about what it means to grow up inside a narrative someone else built, and how long it takes to find your way to your own version of events when the original story is the only one you've been given. Does it come apart eventually? I asked. When the child has enough of their own experience to compare it to, she said. Adolescence, sometimes young adulthood, sometimes a specific event, about what it means to grow up inside a narrative someone else built, and how long it takes to find your way to your own version of events when the original story is the only one you've been given. Does it come apart eventually? I asked. When the child has enough of their own experience to compare it to, she said. Adolescence, sometimes young adulthood, sometimes a specific event. I thought about Sophia, 13, 14, 15, walking through a world that had been pre-explained to her. I kept writing the letters. The years between 2018 and 2023 were the years I rebuilt. I am not going to perform gratitude for my own suffering. It was not a gift, and I won't dress it up as one. Losing access to Sophia was a grief with no funeral and no closure, the kind that lives in your body and comes for you in the middle of ordinary Tuesdays. But I also used the time. I finished the master's degree in neuropsychology I'd been sitting on for 6 years. I took on consulting work for early childhood intervention programs, eventually landing a contract with a regional healthcare network that paid better than my entire clinical career. I sold my house in Charlotte and moved to Atlanta, where I didn't know Jessica's friends or her mother's friends or anyone who would look at me with that particular combination of pity and suspicion. I bought the penthouse in 2021, 12th floor, corner unit, the kind of place that, when my father was alive, would have meant you'd made it. I stood on the balcony the first morning I owned it and thought about all the years I'd made myself smaller than I was, fitting into spaces that weren't designed for me. I was done being small. I kept a photo of Sophia on my desk, her newborn photo. The only one I had. 11 minutes old, cap on her head, eyes squeezed shut like the world was a rude surprise. I updated my documentation folder and labeled it active. In March 2024, Patricia called me. She called at 7:14 in the morning, which told me before she said anything that something had broken. Michael filed, she said. I sat down. When? February. Jessica didn't tell anyone. Michael called me last night. She's moved out. They're separating. I was quiet for a moment. 11 years. 11 years of a marriage held together by Jessica's control of every narrative, and it had ended quietly in February, and I was finding out from Patricia on a Tuesday in March. How's Michael? I asked. Not good, Patricia said, but asking for you. I called Michael that afternoon. He answered on the second ring and said, Mom, and the way he said it, cracked open at the center, told me that he already knew. Maybe not all of it. Maybe not the versions of me that had been circulating at cookouts and birthday parties for a decade, but enough. We talked for 3 hours. He cried twice. I let him. I didn't say I told you so because that was never the point, and also because the man crying on the other end of the phone was still the boy who'd held my hands in a hospital hallway and said she's perfect. I gave him time. What he told me, in pieces, over the following weeks, Jessica had controlled everything. The finances, the social calendar, the story of their marriage. He'd been, in a word he used himself, managed. When he'd tried to push back about me, about access to his own family, about money decisions he wasn't part of, she'd pivoted, turned it around, made him the problem. He described a specific fight in 2019 where he'd told Jessica he wanted to reach out to me, reestablish contact, see if we could rebuild something. She'd cried, told him that if he needed her to, she'd try, but that she'd been carrying so much fear about what my presence would do to Sophia, and she didn't know if she was strong enough to manage it on top of everything else. She'd said it with her eyes down and her hands in her lap, and Michael had felt, in the way she'd engineered him to feel, like the request itself was a form of harm. He hadn't called me. He recognized it now because he'd been in therapy for 8 months with a clinical psychologist named Dr. Aaron Takahashi, who had spent the better part of a year helping Michael identify patterns of psychological control in his marriage. Dr. Takahashi had given his experience a name, coercive control, and had methodically walked him through the mechanisms: isolation, narrative management, manufactured dependency, DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. When Michael explained it to me, I was quiet for a long moment. Then I told him that I had a folder he might want to see. What kind of folder? He said. The kind that proves you weren't crazy, I said. She told me about that, he said slowly. I stopped. What do you mean? She said, years ago, that if things ever went wrong, you'd probably have a file on her, that it was something you'd do, something controlling people do. I let that land. She had preemptively discredited the evidence before it existed. She had told my son in advance that if I ever produced documentation, that documentation was itself proof of my instability. The architecture of it was almost elegant. Almost. She was right that I'd have a file, I said. She was wrong about what it would say. She told me what was done to you, Michael said quietly. What was said about you, to people. To Sophia. I held the phone very still. What did she say to Sophia? There was a long pause. That you had emotional problems, that you weren't safe, that she was protecting Sophia from a difficult situation. Sophia was 12. She had grown up believing her grandmother was dangerous. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Okay, I said. Mom, I'm okay, Michael. Tell me what you need. His financial situation was precarious. Jessica had been the primary manager of their accounts, and her pre-divorce maneuvering had left him in a tangle of joint debts, disputed assets, and a mortgage she'd stopped contributing to while still living in the house. I connected him with Marcus Reed, a family law litigator in Charlotte with 17 years of experience, who'd been recommended by Sandra Marsh as the best divorce attorney she knew for complex financial disputes. Marcus reviewed Michael's situation and used a phrase in our first three-way call that I still think about: controlled asset dissipation. He said it the way doctors say a diagnosis, cleanly, without drama, so you understand you've been ill without the illness being the point. What Jessica had done, methodically, was move money, small amounts over time, to accounts Michael didn't have full visibility on. A joint savings account that had quietly dropped from $87,000 to $31,000 over 18 months. A 529 for Sophia that had been partially liquidated, with the remainder rerouted to an account in Jessica's name alone. A home equity line of credit drawn on without Michael's knowledge because, and this was the part that made Marcus go quiet for a moment, Jessica had forged his signature on the application. That wasn't a civil matter. That was a crime. Marcus was deliberate, methodical, and utterly unsentimental about it. In our second call, he said something I wrote down verbatim. The people who are most effective at financial control are the ones who understand that small, consistent movements leave less evidence than large, sudden ones. What we're looking for isn't a single transaction. It's a pattern. Michael had been in the marriage. He'd seen the individual pieces. He hadn't seen the pattern because you can't see a pattern when you're standing inside it. That's the whole design. The forensic accountant Marcus brought in was a woman named Danielle Forsyth, CPA, CFE, certified fraud examiner, with 14 years in financial investigation, and a calm, unhurried manner that I recognized immediately as the professional equivalent of armor. She spent 6 weeks pulling apart Michael and Jessica's financial history. Her report was 94 pages. I read all of it. I'm that kind of person. The unauthorized HELOC alone was $64,000. The savings account discrepancy, when fully reconstructed, totaled $53,200. There were credit cards in Michael's name that he hadn't opened, with balances totaling $18,700. There were tax filings with income underreported on Jessica's side in ways that created liability on their joint returns. Danielle used the phrase pattern of financial control 14 times in the report. She wasn't being dramatic. It appeared 14 times because it was true 14 times. Marcus submitted the findings to the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office in August 2024. A detective named Carl Whitfield, 12 years in financial crimes, was assigned. Jessica was served with a notice of investigation in September. I know this because Michael called me immediately after it happened. She's scared, he said. I was on my balcony watching the city. She should be, I said. Sophia met me for the first time. Really met me. Consciously, with her own memory intact. On a Sunday afternoon in October 2024, Michael brought her to Atlanta. She was 13 years old, tall, which surprised me. Quiet in the way Michael had always been quiet. Watchful, taking the temperature of a room before she committed to it. She looked at my apartment with wide eyes. You live here? She said. I do, I said. My mom said you lived in, like, a regular house. I did, I said. Things changed. She wandered around, touching things lightly. The bookshelves, the telescope I keep on the balcony, the framed cross-stitch above the kitchen table that my own grandmother made. She stopped in front of the photo on my desk. Is that me? She said. 11 minutes old. She picked it up carefully, looked at it for a long time. My mom said you were... She stopped. Put the photo down. Started again. She said a lot of things. I know, I said. Were any of them true? I looked at my granddaughter. 12 years of her life that I hadn't been in. 12 years of a story she'd been handed without her consent. No, I said. None of them were true, and I can prove it, if you ever want to know. She nodded slowly. Then she sat down at my kitchen table and asked if I had anything to eat, and I made her a grilled cheese, and we talked for 4 hours about school and her friends, and a book she'd been reading, and a science project about deep-sea ecosystems, and at some point, I realized my hands were shaking. Not from fear, from something else entirely, from the ordinary miracle of sitting across from someone you love and simply being allowed to be there. Before she left, I went to my closet and brought out the box. She looked at it. What is that? Letters, I said. I've been writing to you since you were 8 months old, one for every birthday you had, some for random Tuesdays when I was thinking about you. She was very still. I never sent them because I was told not to contact you directly, but I kept writing them because I stopped, found the right words, because you deserve to have someone keeping your story, even if you didn't know yet. She took the box carefully, like it might break. Can I read them? They're yours, I said. They were always yours. She hugged me when she left. Quick, like she wasn't sure she'd get permission for it. Can I come back? She said. Anytime you want, I said. This is also your home. Not vindicated in the way people imagine vindication, a scene, a confrontation, a moment where justice arrives like a verdict read aloud. It was quieter than that. Michael's divorce was finalized in December 2024. The financial fraud findings were incorporated into the settlement, which stripped Jessica of the asset claims she'd built her post-divorce financial plan on. The DA's office was still investigating. As of this writing, no charges had been formally filed, but Danielle Forsyth had been deposed, and Marcus told me to stay tuned. Jessica's professional reputation in the Charlotte social world she'd cultivated for 11 years was in a quiet state of collapse. The friends who'd heard the story of the difficult, dangerous mother-in-law were now hearing a different story, told by the forensic accountant's findings, by Michael's attorney, by the people who had known Michael long enough to know what he'd been like before and what he'd become inside that marriage. Stories, I've learned, have momentum in both directions, which brings me back to January 2025. The suitcases, the intercom, the cortado. I let Jessica ring for 4 minutes. Then I pressed the button. What do you need, Jessica? Can you just... Her voice had something in it I had never heard before. Something that took me a moment to identify because it was so foreign coming from her. Can you just buzz us up? Please. It's cold. Us. She had Sophia with her. I buzzed them up. Sophia came in first, looked at me with something between relief and apology. She'd called me 3 days before from a friend's phone to say things at home were hard. I'd told her she always had a place here. I hadn't known she'd take me up on it quite this literally. Jessica came in behind her, dragging a rolling suitcase, and she looked not what I expected. Not polished, not controlled. She looked like a woman who had been driving on a tire she knew was flat because she had nowhere to stop. She looked around my apartment, slowly, taking in the art, the view, the life I had built in 12 years while she had been busy burning the version of me she'd invented. You did well for yourself, she said. It came out strange, almost honest. Yes, I said. I did. She set the suitcase handle down, squared her shoulders, and there it was. The tilt of the head, the composed voice, the Jessica I recognized. We need a place to stay, just for a little while, until I get things sorted. Sophia needs stability, and your family, and I know things have been, she paused, complicated, but you're her grandmother. And I know you love her. So you thought I'd say yes, I said. I thought you might. I looked at her for a moment, really looked. Then I walked to my desk, opened the bottom drawer, pulled out a folder, not the same one I'd been building for years, but a copy, clean, organized, tabbed by date and category. Things have been, she paused, complicated, but you're her grandmother. And I know you love her. So you thought I'd say yes, I said. I thought you might. I looked at her for a moment, really looked. Then I walked to my desk, opened the bottom drawer, pulled out a folder, not the same one I'd been building for years, but a copy, clean, organized, tabbed by date and category. I set it on the kitchen island. Sophia, I said, your room is the second door on the left. The bathroom towels are in the cabinet under the sink. Go get settled. Sophia looked between us. Then she picked up her backpack and went. Jessica's eyes dropped to the folder. What is that? 12 years, I said. Organized. She didn't move. Every canceled visit. Every false story that found its way back to me through your family's network. The documented timeline of my exclusion from Sophia's life. Sandra Marsh's legal analysis of grandparent standing. Danielle Forsyth's financial report. The public portions. And something new. I opened the folder to a tabbed section near the back. 3 therapists' documentation. Michael's Dr. Takahashi and 2 others. Describing the psychological impact of parental alienation on minor children, with Sophia's name attached. Jessica was very still. Parental alienation, I said quietly, is taken seriously in family courts. So is documented willful exclusion of a grandparent through manufactured narrative, especially when that grandparent has a 12-year paper trail, a family law attorney, and, as of 6 months ago, a granddaughter who is now old enough to speak for herself in a custody evaluation. I don't know what I would do, I said. That depends entirely on what happens next. She stared at me. The head tilt was gone. The composed voice was gone. She was just a woman standing in a kitchen she'd never been invited into, holding a suitcase, looking at 12 years of evidence she thought had never been collected. I want to pause here because I know what you're imagining. The confrontation, the raised voice, the moment where everything comes out and the air fills with damage. It wasn't like that. I was calm in the way that people are calm when they've had 12 years to prepare. When they've sat with a clinical psychologist and a family law attorney and a forensic accountant and a box of 43 letters and they have arrived, finally, at the place where there's nothing left to fear. Fear requires uncertainty. I had no uncertainty left. Jessica's hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly. Just the fingertips. Good. She should understand what it felt like to stand somewhere you hadn't been invited, in a life someone else had built, and feel the ground shift. You can stay, I said. For Sophia, you can stay. There is a guest room. You will have boundaries, and you will respect them. You will not speak to anyone, my family, my neighbors, anyone, about my character or my history. You will not reconstruct the story. You will not perform the version of this that casts you as the reasonable one who reached out. She was quiet. And, I said, you will sit across from me at this table every Sunday until Sophia leaves this apartment, and you will tell her the truth. What was said, what was done, who I actually am. Jessica opened her mouth, closed it. I also want you to know, I said, that Sandra Marsh's office received a copy of this folder in 2018, that Danielle Forsyth's report has been submitted to the DA, that Dr. Nair has written a 9-page summary of what was done to this family over the course of a decade with specific reference to the impact on a minor child, and that Dr. Takahashi has documented Michael's account in clinical records that are admissible. I let that settle. What I have in this folder isn't threat, I said. It's history. It already happened. The only question is what happens next. That's the price of the guest room, I said. She looked at me for a long time, long enough that I could see her doing the calculation, the legal exposure, the financial situation, the daughter in the other room who was already rebuilding something with me that didn't include Jessica's version of events. Okay, she said finally, barely audible. Okay, I said. I picked up my cortado, which was cold now. There are fresh towels in your bathroom too, I said. The coffee maker runs at 6. Help yourself. I walked to the balcony and slid the door open and stood in the morning air, 12 floors up, and looked at the city spread out below me in all directions. Somewhere behind me, I could hear Sophia moving around in the second room, opening drawers, getting settled. I wasn't the broken woman Jessica had left behind. I never was. She just finally had to stand in my house to find that out. If you made it this far, you already know which one of us had the longer game.